I'm Lizbeth Meredith. I want to talk about the unintended consequences of leaving an abusive relationship. When I was 20 and 21, I had a job as a maid in Alaska. That's where I was living. And I met someone who seemed crazy about me. From a different country, seemed so amazing and worldly. And I thought, fantastic. I found my life's partner, somebody who seems to like me and wants to have the same things that I do. From the first week that we married, my then husband stayed out all night, like just disappeared. I had no idea where he was going. This after treating me pretty embarrassingly horrible in front of our wedding guests. So we had a wedding. He took the first dance with someone else, not me. And this was our beginning. Then he stayed out all night the first week. And then all of the things that he seemed to love about me when we were dating were completely unappealing and unattractive and horrible in marriage. Whether it was my looks, you're very heavy for someone your age. You're really out of shape for someone in their early 20s. Oh, you're not very smart. You're clumsy. Oh, if I hadn't have married you, probably no one else would have. With your family background, if I left you, there would be no one there to pick up the pieces. You'd be on your own. So as soon as we got married, he started poking holes in my very fragile self-esteem. And while I look back, the older me thinks, who would believe those messages? I mean, I wasn't perfect at all, but no one is. What I hadn't recognized was I'd become more and more isolated in that relationship. My former husband did not want me to hang out with my family, didn't want me to see my friends, would say things like, this friend is not good enough for you, or that person is a bad influence on you. Why would you want to hang out with them? I got laid off in my day job, the job that I worked at the hotel, and he said, you didn't need that job anyway. You were too good for that job. But there again, I was all by myself in that marriage, hearing very negative messages about myself. And it's much more easy to buy into those messages when there's no one there to counterbalance them. No more friends around, no family, no coworkers. It was me and him, and his opinion of me really started to matter more. I felt like in my relationship, if I could only fix the things that my husband objected to, we'd be fine. So I tried things like losing weight, like learning to cook better, learning to do the laundry without turning the whites pink, those sorts of things. But there were always other objections that he had to me and my role and my behavior. So the relationship went on, and I got pregnant within the first year of marriage. That was unplanned, and it was a shock to the system. I always thought I'd be like my late to mid 20s before I had a child, but here I was expecting. The moment I had known that a baby was coming, there was, to me, an elevated importance in my life. Now there was someone who would rely on me. Now there was a reason to take care of myself. What I didn't realize at the time was that would be the escalation of abuse. If there's someone who's very insecure and controlling, and they feel threatened by someone else being more important than themselves, that can be very difficult. It's very common. I later learned as a domestic abuse advocate for survivors, it's very common for abuse to escalate during pregnancy. And so as the more and more pregnant and content I became, the more threatened he became. So within the first 2 years, I had our first daughter, and it was stunning how much that escalated things. So whether it was, threats like, if you ever left me, I would take this child and disappear. You'll never find me. No one could find me. He was from a different country. He was an American citizen when I met him, but he had roots in another country. So when he said this, it was very jarring. On the other hand, we had good times sometimes as well. Sometimes I would think to myself, I just expect too much. Look, here are his charming sides. I can forgive and forget because, look, he's good to the baby today. And look, he's nice to me today, and he's apologetic for treating me poorly. No one's perfect. So I would focus on forgiving and forgetting, and then things would continue to get worse while I was staying put. When I became pregnant with my second daughter, it was, I'm going to say 10, 11 months after my first daughter was born. And I really was excited to have another child. It was not a scary thing. I was so thrilled. But that really made things more heightened. And so things like, you're not attractive or you're out of shape became, I frankly could kill myself, and you'll always live in that regret. Or I'll disappear with both children. Don't ever think about leaving me. Or, as my second child was born, I could kill you and these children would have no one to take care of them. And you'll know when you're dying. They'll grow up in foster care. I'll be incarcerated. And that's fine. You'll know that. So I knew to stay in control. I knew that I needed to follow the rules that he set forth. And I knew this wasn't looking good. Even though it was just what we call just emotional abuse, it was very clear to me that things could get so much worse if I wasn't careful. So I was careful, and I tried to do the things that he wanted and tried to find reasons to stay put. I'd grown up in divorce and chaos, and I never wanted that for my kids. So I thought it's better to have two parents, no matter how dysfunctional, than to leave and go it alone as a single parent. March 5th of 1990, I was going to turn 26 that year, but I was 25. At 25 years old, two little daughters, one in the crib, one downstairs with me when my husband came home, having disappeared for a long period of time again. We'd argued on the phone because he'd been gone a couple of days, and then a woman called me and said, "Hey, your husband is alive and he's on his way home to you." I naturally did not take well to that phone call. So we got into an argument. My daughter was so upset. And the moment that the argument escalated and he started to strangle me on the floor, had me on the floor pretty quickly, and she was standing there screaming at the age of 2, screaming uncontrollably. I felt the wind leaving, I felt my breath leaving my body. And I thought to myself, I've been a doormat for 25 years, all of my life. I grew up in a home where I was abused. I got into a marriage where I was abused. I felt as though that was my role in life up to that point. Just wipe your feet on me. I am the doormat. And, whatever you need, that's my duty to make sure you have it. That moment, I knew when I was being strangled, that was over. It wasn't just my husband trying to kill me. It was a lifetime I would have to go back and address of being marginalized, oppressed in a way, abused. And I had many good moments in my life in the home that I grew up in, as long as I followed the rules and didn't ever step out of them, things were fine. But it was always a very conditional love, filled with violence at times when I did step out of line. That was going to be over. It wasn't just a decision to leave my husband, it was a decision to leave abuse once and for all. The mom I grew up with, the only mom I've known, had married and married and married again, always looking for something better, but not really mastering the skill of being financially self-sufficient. Some of that was not her fault. That was her generation. She didn't have an education. She didn't have the capacity to get one at the time. So men were, her currency, the way to survive. And I can really respect and feel bad about that because that's a sad history women have. When I decided to leave, I knew I wasn't just leaving that relationship. I was leaving a lifetime of abuse, but it wasn't going to be easy. And so I picked up the girls. I called someone I knew. I did not call the police that day. I did not. Because in 1990, especially in the state of Alaska, well, maybe in all states, but when a survivor called police because of domestic abuse, what happened then, the protocol was the offender would be picked up by a police officer, driven around for a few blocks to cool down, and then released. It was considered to be a private matter, and it wasn't considered to be necessarily a crime all the time. It was a private family matter, and they would show up to just de-escalate, and things could get even worse. After they disappeared in their patrol car, I would be stuck with a very angry husband. I'd already looked into that and called around. And so the day that I decided to leave, I got up, I called a friend. She sent a taxi because my car had been disabled. My former husband had messed with my car so that I couldn't leave, and a taxi came and picked us up. That day, I got a garbage bag and I filled it with the things I could think to bring. My kids' favorite toys, my little one's blankie, a few clothes, a few diapers, some formula, and we went straight away to a friend's home to stay safely. But I was easily tracked there. My husband found me in no time flat. And so I went to stay at the domestic abuse shelter with my daughters. It was the worst experience and the best experience all at once. It was everything no one would ever want to do with their lives. When you're thinking about who you want to be when you grow up, few of us think, I'd like to stay in a shelter. And so there I was with my kids, exposing them to so many people who were in crisis. And, living in a dorm style situation, some people having mental health episodes and trauma episodes. But there was staff there. And I remember the day that we arrived, a staff member saying, you don't deserve to be treated poorly. You're going to be safe here. You're not alone. We want to help you. And so from that moment forward, I really felt like, okay, the bottom has fallen out of my world. I can't be proud. There's nothing left. There's no pride left. So what my domestic abuse survivor advocate said, you need to go enroll for public assistance if you're ever going to get out of the shelter. And I said, oh no, I don't need to do that. And she said, you can't possibly make enough money to pay for the daycare for these two kids without an education. You have to do this. So I enrolled in, for public assistance. I enrolled for Section 8 housing. And who knew, but when you get services like that, you can become more of a priority on Section 8 housing, subsidized housing for a really horrible apartment. I got a Pell Grant. I enrolled in college. I would move to one place. My former husband would move to, nearby. He would be my neighbor. I would take the time when we were, let's say, he had the children for his visitation, the court-appointed visitation. I would go to, I remember, a square dancing lesson. He showed up. My children were nowhere to be seen, but there he was. This was well before the day of tracking devices, but he seemed to have nailed the art of tracking. So it didn't get easier. It wasn't like leaving was the exact recipe for a safe life for my children. The stronger I became, the scarier and more threatened he became. So over the years, I left. My children were tiny, but as they had visits with their dad, which happens, they would come home as they got older and say, Mommy, Daddy says you're going to die. Mommy, Daddy says you're going to die and you're going to hell. Mommy, Daddy says you're going to find someone else and you'll never want us. Mommy, Daddy says you're going to leave us and find someone new. And so what I didn't understand, even though I'd get a protective order when I could, try to modify the custody arrangements, I wasn't negligent. I wasn't not paying attention. But all the while, that was happening to my children during visits. And then when that didn't work, my husband and then former husband would use the system that I relied on to abuse me further. He would say things to public assistance. An anonymous report would float in. We hear that a man is living in your apartment, your subsidized apartment, and we need to go through the apartment to verify that you're not committing fraud, public assistance fraud. Oh, we hear that you've abused your children and we need to strip search them now to make sure that you're not beating them. This was the kind of thing that happened that just escalated over time. And then 4 years after I left him, so 4 long years of that. And there were many good times in the middle of it. I loved living with my children, and I got a great roommate, a woman, and I found hobbies, and I learned to understand myself and what mattered to me and, what didn't, and kind of identified my values and my mission. I became a domestic abuse survivor advocate, and I started doing trainings for judges and law enforcement and, presented zillions of presentations on recognizing signs of abuse and what to do if someone you care about is being abused. 4 years after I left him, my former husband took the children on his court-appointed visit and left the country. Once I left the country, it took 2 solid years to reconnect and reunite with my children. From the beginning, lawyers in Alaska, where I lived, who agreed to sign on to the case for no payment, mind you, Then finding lawyers in the country of Greece where my children had been taken to, it took a lot of advocating for myself through local police department because the police did not want to listen to me when I said my children were not visiting their nice dad for an extra long time. They were kidnapped and taken out of country. And this was, of course, pre-internet, for the common person. This was at a time where you couldn't just sign online or onto Facebook. This was like back in the dinosaur ages practically. But I dealt with police department who were not familiar with dealing with domestic abuse and or dealing with child abduction, much less international child abduction. So getting lawyers, getting a private investigator, getting the State Department to help in spots, even engaging senators and congressmen to listen to my story and understand why it was important to get my children back. It made my life bigger than I could have ever imagined. I found myself advocating in places. I went to the White House at one point. I was very fortunate. Went to the White House and met with the president's attorney while my kids were missing. And still, it was so difficult. I went to Greece the first time 1 year after my children were missing. Between the time that my kids went missing, I needed to make sure that the country of Greece would recognize and enforce my custody order. And then at some point during the whole mess, the attorneys in Greece went on strike for a long time. So I did finally get to go a year after my children were missing. I went to Greece, met with my local attorneys there. I had raised enough money through fundraisers, not by myself, but through my amazing coworkers and through friends. So I had enough money to pay them for part of it. I got to Greece and they had a private investigator who eventually located my husband and children and my former husband and children. So when I went to execute the custody order, we had a problem. We had a snafu. And unfortunately, my former husband was notified that I was in the country and he grabbed the children out of the school that they were living in, out of the place they were living in, and disappeared further. So I was there for 6 weeks and did not get my children, and I had to come home without them. I wasn't able to make a whole lot more money through fundraisers between the time that happened and the next time that I went to Greece, almost a year later. But I just made the executive decision I would go find my kids. My attorneys in Greece were understandably upset with me because I was super headstrong, wanted to have more input than they wanted me to have, and I didn't have the money to pay them fully. I did not. And so they were mad at me, they quit, then they joined again. We had a different private investigator. Ultimately, my kids and I were eventually reunited 2 years and a little bit further than that after they first went missing. And they didn't speak English any longer. They had been told I died. They'd been told so many things. And so they were excited to see me when I showed up at their school, but they were terrified. And then my former husband accused me of kidnapping our children as I decided to leave as I went to execute my custody rights and leave the country. It's a longer story there, which I did talk about extensively in the book that I wrote, but I was in Greece for 3.5 months, I'm going to say the second time. So a long period of time. What helped me then was coworkers gave leave, their own personal leave, to me to help me stay so that I didn't run flat out of money. And amazing Greek people, helped me. Some of the attorney's friends, stay there cheaply, gave me emotional support, all of that. Eventually we were reunited and we did go through those series of hearings in Greece. Ultimately, what happened was what we were told would never happen. Greece is a part of what's called the Hague Convention for missing children or kidnapped children, meaning that they agreed that if children were kidnapped and taken to their country, they would immediately petition or push to have those children returned to their home of habitual residence, and the parents could fight out their custody problems where the children were from. So I was so excited thinking that was going to work in my favor. It did not. What happened ultimately was the judge decided they've been here 2 years. They speak Greek now. It's so sad for you, but you should go home. They're used to it in Greece. You go home and you can come back next fall and we can have more hearings. At that point, I made an executive decision to leave the country with my children, make it through Turkey with the help of many people. Trust me, I'm not that smart and I have no sense of direction, but went by boat to Turkey and then made our way through London and then came back home. And then we fought it out in federal court and won. After leaving abuse at the age of 25, it feels so great to spend the majority of my days, even now, helping people tame trauma and increase resilience. It's not that trauma ever goes away. It's not that I can ever put it out of my head and, walk forward. It comes back to you like a boomerang. But to help tame it and incorporate it into our lives, it does feel great.